All right, let's get our client side set up. So we, in the last video, set up our server. We've got our GraphQL. You can see in graphical pulling in some information. But this isn't really useful as far as an application. We don't have anything for our user to actually see, and they're not going to go into graphical and look up this information. So let's see how we can get it going in our front end. So right now, I've got our server running on port 5000. I'm going to shut that down. And what I'm going to do is just create a React app in this same directory. So do npx create React app, and I'm going to call it client. And in the same directory, it's going to create our client folder with all the React boilerplate. You could kind of do this from scratch if you want to. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to use create React app. It's going to give us everything that we need, just so you can see kind of how everything gets set up. So while we're in here, while we're in the package.json of our server, so notice you can see the client folder has been generated, but we're still in the root directory. In package.json of our server, we're going to add a couple of scripts. We are going to add one called client npm start -- prefix client, and then one called dev, which we'll do concurrently, and then / double quote npm run server / double quote, and then secondly we'll do / double quote npm run client, and then / double quote, and then a comma at the end. So we kind of got ahead while the create React app was spinning up, but what we're doing here is in our root directory, we are creating this script called dev, which is going to simultaneously run our server and our client. So because we've got two kind of like separate sections, we've got our front end and we've got our back end. So our back end is in this root directory and our front end is actually in this client. We want to be able to run each piece of the application simultaneously. If we didn't have this script set up, what we'd have to do is do npm run server, and then we'd have to go into our client and do something like, yarn start or npm run start, and we'd have our server running on localhost 5000 and our React client running on host 3000, and we'd have to keep track of that simultaneously in two separate terminals, which is fine, but this just makes it a little bit easier. So by using concurrently, we're able to run both the front end and the back end with one script. So it's a nice little convenience for us. So we haven't actually set this up on the client side, so let's go ahead and dive in. If you open up the client directory, we are going to install a few dependencies here. So in our terminal, I'm going to cd into client, and then I'm going to do yarn add, and I'll do Apollo boost GraphQL tag moment React moment React Apollo React router DOM and Tailwind CSS. Let's double check my notes to make sure I got all these. So Apollo boost GraphQL tag moment React Apollo React. Cool. All right, so these are all the dependencies that we need just in our client package.json. So right now, the file that we're looking at is the server side. If we go inside of client and look at this package.json, now we can see all of these different dependencies, some of which came with React and some of which we just added ourselves. While we're in here, let's go ahead and update a few things. One of the dependencies that we installed was called Tailwind, and that's a styling library. You don't have to use that. That is not absolutely essential to this project. However, I like to use Tailwind, especially when building out prototypes, but you can use it certainly in production as well. But it's I've got another video on setting this up with Gatsby, but it's essentially, you know, as user-friendly as something like Bootstrap, where you just add some classes to your elements and you can style them right there in your components, and get a nice feel for what your styles are going to look like. So we added that. So to get that up and running, we're going to add a new script called build style. Sorry, build colon style. Ah, man, I put another quote there. Build colon style. All right, and then what we're going to do is tailwind build is the command, and we're going to tell it to look in the source directory in a folder called styles, which we will create. And we're going to tell it to look for index.css in that folder. Then -o, it's going to output our code into another file called source styles/tailwind CSS. We did not create this file yet. We will. Index.css is actually, it's already been created for us. We're just going to move it into, we're going to create a folder and we're going to move this file. But basically, this script is designed to build all of our styles, looking for the directions in this index.css file, and then it kind of compiles everything into this Tailwind CSS file for us. And then the last thing we need to do as far as scripts is add to our start, where we do npm run build style and React script start. So we're just tacking on to this start. We're telling it basically to combine build style with the start command or script, excuse me. All right. So that looks like it should be good to go. A little bit more setup for Tailwind. So in source, I'm going to create a new folder called styles. I'm going to take my index.css and move it into styles. I'm going to delete app.css. And then in styles, I'm going to make a new file called tailwind.css. Tailwind, notice, is a blank file. Once we run that build command, it's going to auto-populate the code that it's looking for to let the client know that, like, hey, here's the styles for everything. So we don't actually need to touch this file at all. That we just needed to create it. So we can close that. And then in our index.css, we can delete all this stuff. And then we can do, we can add our directives for Tailwind. So Tailwind base @Tailwind components and @Tailwind utilities. So in this index.css file, you could add other styles. Like if you had, like let's say you had a button with an ID of submit, and you wanted to make the background color of that purple. This would totally be valid. That's fine. So you can combine Tailwind with other styles. But you do need, in order for it to get up and running, you do need to have these imports at the top of your index.css in this case. So we'll close that. Package.json looks fine. Package.json here looks fine. Our server looks fine. So we're in our client. I'm going to cd back into our root directory. And remember that script from our server package.json where we had concurrently. So let's run npm run dev and see what we get. We'll probably get a couple errors because of some. So that's good sign. We've got building saved to the Tailwind CSS. That's awesome. Starting the development server. I think we're going to get a few errors because we moved some stuff around. So we'll go back and clean that up. All right, so module not found. All right, so let's look in our client. So app.js. So we removed this app.css. We can delete that. And we can actually delete this logo too. We can remove all of this stuff. And then let's just do a p tag that says home page. And to test out to see if Tailwind is working, we'll do font bold and text red 700. And let's see here. That should be loading on 3000 if it's working. All right, so can't resolve index.css. Okay, so that is because we moved index.css. This is looking like a path issue. So that should be in index.js. And there it is. So what this is actually going to be looking for is not index.css anymore. This is going to be referencing our Tailwind file. So if we go to styles / Tailwind CSS. Cool, and that cleaned up the error, and there you can see homepage is bold, and it's got that red color. And let's see if we do like text 3XL, and now it's bigger. Awesome. So I'm not going to deep dive into Tailwind here, but you can see that we're just doing some styling by adding these classes, which is super convenient for just getting our stuff up and running. All right, awesome. So now we can dive in to getting our main app file set up. We're going to end up making two components. One is going to be a games component. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to display all of the games in a given day. So we'll be able to use Moment to generate, help us out with a date picker input. And then whatever date that we select, the games component will show us all of the games. So if it's in the past, it'll show us all the scores. If it is let's say it's today's games, it'll show us all the scores of games that are going on or finished, or it'll show us the times that they're scheduled for. And then same thing for future games. It'll show us when they're scheduled, depending on what data is available in that Ball Don't Lie API. So we need a couple of imports in our app.js. We need Apollo client from Apollo Boost. We need, in curly braces, we need Apollo provider from React Apollo. We need, in curly braces, browser router as router and route from React Router DOM. And then we're going to bring in, so I've got a logo. I went and searched NBA logo and downloaded it. I've got it in this other folder, so I'm just going to drag it over into my source directory. It's just this NBA logo. So you can just download this off of there and import that. So we'll import, and you can call this whatever. I'm calling it logo. from dot slash nba.png. So it's in the same directory and it's called nba.png. And then I'm going to import a component that we have not yet created, which is called games. And we're going to put that in a folder called components. And the component name is going to be called games. So we haven't actually made this yet, but we are going to make a folder called components. And we're going to make this component called games. All right. So if you're familiar with like React context, or if you've used Redux before, you're probably familiar with the concept of provider. So what we actually need to do is wrap our application with this provider so that it can pass down the data from our server, from GraphQL. So what we'll do is Apollo provider, and we're going to set our client equal to a client variable. We have not yet made this. And then we'll just paste everything in the middle. So this client is not defined. We need to define it. And what that is saying is, Apollo provider, where are you getting your information from? So let's make a const called client, which we'll set to a new Apollo client. And that takes in a URI, which will be http://localhost 5000/GraphQL. And if you're thinking, hey, that address sounds familiar, that's because it's the address that we use to get all of our data, localhost 5000/GraphQL. GraphQL. So we can make our queries here and we get our information. Awesome. And so what we're saying is this is where you're getting that information, and now you're passing it into the Apollo provider. So now that information is accessible to the components that we'll make. So let's go ahead and make our games component. So in source, we'll make another folder called components. And we'll make a new file called games.js. Inside of our games.js, we're going to import React, use effect, use effect, and use state from React. We're going to import GQL from GraphQL tag. We're going to import use query from Apollo/React hooks, which is significantly cleaner, in my opinion, than the non-hook, like class-based version of the Apollo queries. We're going to import link from React router DOM, and we're not going to use that actually right away. We're going to use that down the road. And then import moment from moment to help us with our date formatting. All right, so those are all the imports that we need. Now we're going to start actually building out our component with the query that it's going to use to pull in the data, which will then populate the component so that we can actually see this on the front end. So we're going to export default function games. And you could set this up as an arrow function too if you prefer. Export default const games and do an arrow function. We're going to do our query here. So we're going to call it all games query. And it's common practice with GraphQL on the front end to capitalize and underscore any of your queries. I'm going to set this equal to GQL and then backticks. So that's how you're gonna mark that a GraphQL query is coming. Then our query name is going to be all games query, and it's going to take in a date, which should be a string. So what this is saying is the all games query takes in a date. We let GraphQL variables are marked with a $sign at the beginning, and we're just saying that that date should be in the form of a string as opposed to like an int, for example. And so you can see an example of what this looks like here. Note that all games takes in a date, which we hard-coded here. What this is doing is saying, all right, this is going to be a variable that's determined somewhere on the client's side so that we're not hard coding the date, but we're letting the user choose the date, and then we're going to spit back out the results. All right, so we'll open up curly braces just like we did here in our query on the back end. And we're going to look for all games where the date is equal to the date that we passed in. So again, if you look at this structure, all games takes in a date. Well, that date is going to be equal to the date that is passed in as the variable as a string here. We're going to return the home team with the full name and the ID. We're going to return the visitor team with the full name and the ID. We are going to return the home team score, the visitor team score, the status, and the ID. And we can run all these queries here if we wanted to as well. So we could do visitor team score. Let's do status and ID just to keep it quick, as opposed to doing the home team as well. So you can see the New Orleans Pelicans, they're in the second quarter. They have 59 points, and the ID of the game is 63283. So this is the information that we're going to get, but by getting the home team and the visitor team score, we're going to be able to see the actual matchups. All right, next, in order to populate this date with a variable, we're going to use a hook. So we have date, which is our like piece of state that we're going to update, and then we have our actual updater, which is set date, excuse me. And we're going to use the initial state. Use the initial state with a little help from moment. So I mentioned that moment is a like a time library. Moment.js. So this will help you a lot in terms of like formatting dates and things like that. So if I go back to the homepage, so the documentation's pretty awesome. But like take, for example, moment format. So when you call moment just by itself, so I'll cut this just for example. So when you call moment by itself, that's going to give you like a new date. So what is the time and date right now? And then you can format that pretty much however you want. And remember, with the Ball Don't Lie API, when we're looking for games, when you want a specific game, you can get them by start date or end date in this format: year, month, day. So we're going to actually format this where we have the same format as it's looking for on the API documentation. All right, so this date is what we're going to end up using here as the variable that it's looking for to decide, All right, what is the date here so that we're not hard coding it each time? All right, then we can start using that use query hook to populate our component. So we'll do const and then curly braces loading, error, and data. So we get access to these three pieces of information. So is it loading? Yes or no? Is there an error? And then if it's done loading and there's no error, then we'll get the data, which is this stuff over here. We're going to set that equal to use query. And that takes in the query itself and then any variables. And in this case, the variable is the date. Variables. Oops, this should be wrapped, so I'm going to cut this. And after the comma, curly braces, and then I'm going to paste that back. And I'll hit save, so it should be formatted a little bit more nicely. Cool. So loading error and data equals use query. It takes in our all games query from above, and then it also takes in any variables. If we don't have any variables, then cool, like this doesn't matter. But in this case, we are looking for games that happened on a specific date, so we are pulling in that variable. So we're going to say if loading is true, then we'll just return a paragraph tag with loading. So super simple. You can put a spinner there or something like that if you want to make it look nice. If there's an error, we'll console log it. And then if not, then we'll actually go ahead and get back our data. So let's just console log the data and see what we get, and then we can just return a div with a paragraph tag that says games component. And let's just see what we get. So in our React app, okay, so we don't have games. Let's see, make sure we've exported that. So app, games is here, and we can just put this games. So our component is now there. Cool. So there's our games component. And let's take a look at the console and see what our data is. Network error when attempting to fetch resource. Cross-origin request blocked. Okay, awesome. So, well, not awesome, but this was actually anticipated. So basically what's happening here is we're on localhost 3000, but we're trying to access data from localhost 5000/GraphQL, which is giving us a cross-origin error here because we're trying to deal with data on from two different URLs. It's giving us this error. So what we want to do, let's go ahead and close down the server. So in NBA scoreboard, we should already have this installed. Let's take a look. So in our package.json, in our root directory, so not inside of client, but in our root directory, we have cores. So this is a package that's going to help us with this issue. So now if we go into server.js, we can bring in cores. So const cores equals require cores, and then we'll just use this. So app.use cores and save, and that should take care of that issue. Let's clear this out. Tailwind's building back up. All right. So let's refresh our localhost 3000 and let's see. Okay, cool. So now we don't have that error anymore. And remember, from our games component, we're just console logging the data. And let's see what data we got back. So object. all games, and it's an array. And I'll open this up a little bit to give us some more space. Okay, cool. So we have 9 different objects. So we have a game, the home team, the Cavs against, let's see, the Pelicans. And we've got the ID and the full name of each team. It's in the second quarter, 63-72. All right, cool. Looks like Zion is beating up on the Cavs right now. So awesome. So now we're getting our information. So let's see how we go about putting that in. So if you notice, if I refresh this, that all games is the name of the object that we're, or the name of like the data point that we're referencing here of this array. And that's because we named it all games up here. So when we're referencing this this information, we'll need to make sure that we have data, and then like let's say we did data.all games, and then hit save. You'll see, okay, cool. Now we have our array of information. So that's where that's getting that all games from. All right, so let's see. Let's do, we can get rid of this console log, and let's put in the ability for the user to be able to select what date they want to see. So let's do a label HTML4, and we'll say date, and then we'll say show games for, and now we can make our date input. So there are like libraries that you can do like date pickers and stuff for, but you can actually just set an input as a date type and just use that kind of native HTML functionality. So we'll do that for now. So the input, the value is equal to that date piece of state that we created earlier. The type equals date, so that we know that that input is going to be like a little calendar thing. The ID is date, so that the label, the HTML4 label, matches up with this. Whenever this changes, we'll take in E, so the event, and we'll set date to the value of it. So e.target.value. So this is saying anytime this input changes, we're going to update that date piece of state to set the date to whatever date the user inputs. And then lastly, we're going to set a pattern so that the format remains consistent. And we'll do that like this, where it's /d4 dash /d2 dash /d2. And then we can close that off and save it and just format a little bit more nicely. Okay, so show games for 1/28/2020. Awesome. So what this pattern thing is doing is just saying like take in a 4-digit date and then have a dash and then a 4-digit number and then a dash, then a 2-digit number and then a 2-digit number. And so we get this date here. And then what we'll do is underneath the input, we'll do data. So data is referencing this query. And then data.allGames, because remember, all games was here. And now we can just map through that array. So data.allGames.map, and then for each game, we will return let's see, what information do we want? So we'll get a div. And notice too that I have a parentheses opening up and closing there. That's an implicit return. So I could do, you know, curly braces and then return all my stuff. Instead, what I'm doing is just using parentheses to implicitly return everything that I'm typing down here. And let's do div with a key that's equal to the game.id because that should be unique. And then let's do, how about a paragraph tag with the game dot home team. So home team here dot full name. So we're just accessing this in the same sort of dot notation that we usually use with objects. So game dot home team dot full name. Full name. And then we can do colon. Let's do their score. So game dot home team score. And then we can do versus game dot visitor team dot full name, and then their score. So colon game dot visitor team score, and then close that off. And if I save it, all right. So we've just got a p tag with game, the home team's name and their score versus the visitor team full name and their score. All right, so this doesn't look awesome now, but you can see that it's working. Let's see, why don't we give this a class of margin top 4. So we get a little bit more space. And notice, like, let's update this. So if I do 8 and then hit save, notice the loading. So loading, and then it gives us our information, which is pretty nice. Why don't we center this? So class name equals flex column, and then items center, I think, should do it. Cool. So this is all centered up for us nicely. So we've got our little scoreboard. So let's say we want to change this date. So let's style the input a little bit better and give it a class name. And we're just doing this, again, all with Tailwind, which is pretty sweet. So border 2, so giving it a 2-pixel border, and border gray 500. So just, this is like 2-pixel border, and the color is like a medium gray, and then P2 is padding. Cool, so now it's styled a little bit better, and if I click on this, now I've got all these dates. So let's see how things went a week ago on the 21st. Loading, and the Mavs lost to the Clippers. Let's go to the 31st and see the schedule. All right, so this is just giving us scores, 0, 0, 0. So that's not super helpful. So right now, you could kind of like take this a bunch of different ways. I'll show you some different ideas that I've got as far as like making this a little bit more useful, so that people could find this application like nice, and then you could go about styling it and adding on to it as you see fit. So let's clear this out and hit X. Oh, okay, cool. So here we're getting an error. Data.allGames is null because it's expecting a date. And let's see if we delete this and do nothing. Syntax error, unexpected. So that's essentially what's happening here. Because we cleared the date out, there is no date. So what we can do with this is we can use the useEffect hook to make sure that we've always got a date as kind of a fallback. So underneath the set date hook, I'm going to use effect. And we'll have an arrow function that says if there's no date, then set the date to moment right now dot format, and then format it the way that the API wants it. And then if you've seen my video on useEffect, or if you're familiar with the useEffect hook, we want to add our dependency array. So this useEffect hook is only going to run whenever the date changes. So it's going to look out. So because useState, this date piece of state is initially populated with a moment right now, then this useEffect hook doesn't need to run right off the bat. So that's fine. But anytime this date changes, if there isn't a date, then we're going to set the date to whatever today is. And so that should take care of that error. So if we do change the date to like December 31st, it's loading. Cool. We've got some scores. Now if we X out of this, it just resets us back to our today's date, which is helpful and prevents some errors. So I showed you, like, we see games in the future, but they're all zeros. So what do we do about this? So we can use some conditional formatting to potentially show us some results here. So let's do it like this. We have the home team score. So if the home team score doesn't equal 0, then we'll render the score. So I'm just going to do it in a span. Actually, I think I can do it in a fragment. Let's do it. Try in a fragment. Let's see if that imported at the top. It did not, so fragment. Just so we're not having a bunch of extra divs and spans and stuff running around that we don't need. So if the score isn't 0, then we'll show this score instead of our fragment. So let's check this out and see if that works. Let's go to the future. Okay, so you can see that this is working for some of our team, it looks like our home teams. So the Atlanta Hawks, the Boston Celtics, none of these guys have scores, but the other teams do. Okay, so that's good. And let's actually bump that, colon over too. So I can get rid of this quote thing here and get rid of the colon. And then I'll do colon, or no, that should be outside. So colon, okay, so fragment, colon, home team score. So that way we can see, good. So the New Orleans Pelicans versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Now let's do the same thing. I'll just copy this line of code here. So I'll get rid of the colon. And then the game.visitor team score doesn't equal 0. And we'll return a fragment with the colon. So if the score isn't 0, then the fragment will give us back this score. And then let's see. So cool. So we can see on the 31st, we've just got a schedule of games. And you could change up this conditional formatting too. I realize, like, if a game just started, then, like, you know, say some team's off to a hot start and they're up like 15-0, then it might be like New Orleans Pelicans 15, Memphis Grizzlies, and you don't see a score. So that's not super helpful. So maybe you, like, set this to like relative to the game status, but you can see that we're using conditional formatting here. So if the visitor team score doesn't equal 0, then we'll render this this piece of information. And then what we can do is underneath, we can do another p tag, and we'll do game, and let's see, we've got game, we can do status. So game dot status, and we should be able, let's see how this renders. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, so second quarter, 8:30. So let's this div here, let's style it. So we have class name equals flex call, and then items center. Cool. So now we've got a little bit of a scoreboard. Second quarter, we've got times for future games. If we look into the future, February 6th, we can see a schedule here. So all of this is really nice. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to make a team component. So if I want to click on the Los Angeles Lakers, let's say I want to get some more information on them, then I'll be able to click on this and take me to like a little LA Lakers page. And if you wanted to, you can get some like stats about them or some players on that team or whatever. You can kind of take this even farther than we're already taking it. So inside, let's go back to our app.js. And what we're going to need to do is actually use this browser router to set up some routes. So let's cut all this out of here. And inside of our Apollo provider, we'll do router. And then we can use that logo from before instead of just putting homepage up here. So we can have a div. And the class name for this div will be flex call, justify center, items center. And let's just do h full so that it takes up the whole height of the screen. And then we'll have a div to start, which will be our image with the source of logo. So that's referencing the logo from up here. And the alt will be NBA logo. And we'll give this a class name of flex justify center, and then margin bottom of 8. And then next we'll do route exact path equals slash. So that's going to be our home page, and the component that it's going to take in is our games component. And let's give that a save and see if everything's working. Cool. So there's our NBA logo. We're at localhost 3000, and we can see our scores from today. Great. And I'll close this off. So now what we want to do is we want to set up a route where if we click on these names, it'll take us to those pages. So we'll set up a new route where the exact path equals, and we'll create this. So teams / and then :ID. So that's going to tell us, this is like a React router's way of saying that we're looking for a variable where that ID is going to be dynamic. And the component is going to be the team component that we haven't yet created. And we can import that. So we'll do team from, and we'll get an error because we haven't created this component yet. There it is. So let's go ahead and make this component. So inside of components, new file, team.js. Now I'm going to move a little bit more quickly here since we've already we're going a little bit long, and this is just kind of extra cherry on top. So import React, and then we're going to use fragment from React. We're going to import GQL from GraphQL tag. We're going to import use query from Apollo/React hooks, and import link from React router DOM. Then we're going to create our functional component. Export default function team, and this is actually going to take in props so that we can populate our URL. Then we're going to call a team query, and then GQL, and we'll open up with backticks. And the query is going to be called team query, where it's looking for an ID variable, and that ID should be an int. And it's going to return the following query: team with the ID set to the variable ID that we pass in here. And then we're going to return, we'll do the full name, the conference, and the division. And remember, we did something like this when we did the server video together. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say the ID equals props. And we're going to console log those props so we can see. I just want to kind of show you something that's going on. And then we'll use our use query hook again. So const loading error and data equals use query. We're going to take in that team query from above, and then we do have one variable, so we're going to say variables is the ID. If loading, return loading. If there's an error, console log the error. And then what we're going to actually do is some destructuring. So we'll say const full name, division, and conference are equal to data.team. So in games, remember, I'll come back to that. We had like data.allgames, and then we have game.hometeam.fullname. So what we're doing with object destructuring is we're setting full name, conference, and division to data.team so that we can then reference these pieces of information directly. And then let's just do a return a div that says, oh, and that should be parentheses. That's why I'm getting an error. So parentheses div, and let's say a p tag with team. All right. So let's see here. If we go to our graphical and we query for a team with an ID of 5, and we say city and full name, we're going to get the Chicago Bulls. Cool. So remember that this query is set up the same way, where we're taking in an ID. That ID is a variable, which in this case, we're not setting as state. We're setting it as equal to these props that we're taking in here. So let's see what's going on with those props. So if we go to localhost 3000 and then /teams/5 for the ID for the Bulls. Let's see what happens here. So data is undefined. Let's see if we're getting any information here. Data is undefined. See, okay, cool. This is what we're looking for here. So from team.js 17, line 17, we're logging the props. So this is what I wanted to show you, the information for how we're updating this ID. So we're getting these props, history, location, match, and look here, the path, teams / and then that ID variable. If we open up match and we have the piece of information that we're looking for is the ID. So how do we update this piece of information based on the team that the person clicks? And so if you break this apart, we've got props, match, params, ID is 5. So we need to access that information, and that's why we're passing it down through props. So what we're going to do is we're going to let our props, or let our ID equal props.match.params.id. And so this is going to set the ID variable equal to this number 5. But notice this is a string, and the ID is looking for an int. So that's why we said let ID equal these things. And then what we're going to do, ID equals parse int ID. And so there we go. Now we've got our team. And if we did, let's go back to the home page. And let's do /teams4. Cool. Team. Great. So that's not super useful yet. So what we can do now is we can set up a link so that whenever we click on one of these team names, it'll populate with whatever ID, the ID of the team. So let's do that. In games, we're going to go back to the information that we mapped through to populate this information. And what we're going to do for the full name is I'm going to cut, actually, I'm not going to cut. I'm going to wrap this with a link. So link to, let me drop this on the second line. So link to equals, and we're going to set this to teams /$ curly braces game.home.team.id, and then close that off, and then just bump my full name there. So now all of my home teams should be clickable, and you can see there's a cursor pointer that pops up just for the home teams. So Pelicans, Suns, none of these are going to do anything, but if I click on Cavaliers, notice that now, cool, now it's teams 6. If I go back, Mavericks, teams 7. If I go to 76ers, teams 23. So it's dynamically taking the ID, sorry, not that ID. It's taking the ID from the home team, and it's passing that information on so that then team can take in the props.match.params.id and match that information so we can route it to the correct team. So now instead of saying team, what we want to do is we'll make this a little H2 and we'll say full name referenced here. We'll say conference is equal to colon there, and then conference from this piece here, and then division. And then just for, I know this is not a master course in UX here, but for a slightly better experience, we'll have a link back to the home page, and we'll do and LARR semicolon and then back, and that'll allow the user to go back. And then let's center this up. So we'll do class name flex call item center. All right, so now we can go back. We can go to the Lakers, back. We can go to the Raptors, Conference East, Division Atlantic. Awesome, and we can go back. And now we can do the same thing for our visitor team. So we can just wrap the, get rid of this, wrap the visitor team full name in a link. So I cut it, and I'll do link to equals curly braces, and then backticks teams slash $ curly braces game dot visitor team dot ID, and then close that off, and then we'll save that. And now I can go to Cleveland Cavaliers, I can go back, I can go to Pelicans, and in the time I've been making this video, the Pelicans have just kept on opening it up on the Cavs. Tough break. All right, so we've gone through. Now you can go back in time. You can see previous scores. You can go ahead in time and see the schedule. So we've gone through how to set up a server, how to query data on the back end, how to then connect that to the front end, how to use queries, how to utilize Apollo and GraphQL to populate the data that we're pulling in from our server on the front end so that the user can then use it. Using Moment and using Tailwind to kind of get our prototype up and running. Obviously, this doesn't look beautiful at all, but it was pretty quick to kind of get things centered and spaced out a little bit. And I think a little bit easier than, like, you know, even something like inline styling. Using this input to populate the dates and format things. So it's pretty cool. And you can go pretty deep with this API. So again, players, teams, games. With all the information that we've gone over in these two videos, I would definitely recommend taking this a few steps further. So even if it's just this and you go ahead and style it and make it look a little bit nicer, and maybe you turn it into, like, you know, something that looks like an actual scoreboard that you'd see at a gym. Or maybe you go even further and, you know, you, instead of, you know, Celtics and it's got their division, maybe you put in a roster and you get some stats on their players or things like that. You're totally equipped with all of that knowledge to be able to do all that now. So I know that the server video was pretty long and this one was pretty long as well. But I really wanted to show you kind of like the different thought processes that go along while we're coding this up, and also to, like, you know, to not just to edit this all, but to show you that, like, yeah, mistakes happen all the time, and to get a real glimpse of what that stuff looks like. It was always helpful for me to see other people going through that, and I hope it's helpful for you as well. So thanks for sticking it out. You know, let me know what you thought in the comments. If you like it, go ahead and subscribe. I'm going to be putting out more videos as the weeks come by. But again, thanks a lot for hanging out, and I'll see you on the next one.